Gentlelady is recognized to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment will restore and expand the historic tax credit. The historic tax credit has been a key redevelopment tool in districts across America, helping to revitalize cities, towns, and rural communities by encouraging private sector investment in rehabilitation and reuse of historic buildings. Nationwide, it has helped renovate more than 42,000 historic buildings. In my state of Alabama alone, since 2002, 128 historic tax credit projects resulted in $280 million in total economic development. Just in my district, there have been 48 historic tax credit projects since 2002 in cities with civil rights histories like Birmingham, Selma, Marion, and Montgomery. The federal historic tax credit creates jobs, Mr. Chairman. It is a good investment for local communities, individual states, and the nation. The cumulative impact of the program since 1978 includes 2.5 million jobs and billions of dollars in economic gain. The positive impact on the economy speaks for itself. Historic tax credits have generated $291.7 billion in output, $144.9 billion in GDP, $106.6 billion in income, and yes, $41.7 billion in taxes. Mr. Chairman, the historic tax credit is a great return on investment. $25.2 billion in historic tax credit costs encourages 5 times greater amount of investment in renovation, $131.8 billion, a great return on investment. Again, I say to my Republican colleagues, repealing incentives for key investments in economic development like historic tax credit will raise less than $50 billion in revenue and yet decrease the amount of economic rehabilitation by $131.8 billion. Mr. Chairman, this is a no-brainer. The economic revitalization of our downtowns from core urban areas to Main Street towns requires investments like the historic tax credit to focus investment where it is needed most. Mr. Chairman, in closing, no one makes the case for historic tax credits better than President Reagan, who in 1984 said, "Our historic tax credits have made the preservation of our older buildings not only a matter of respect for beauty and history, but of course for economic good sense." So I ask my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment. Let's send a message to towns and cities across America that we believe in them. Please vote for my amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real quick on this, but I rise in opposition to the amendment. One of the challenges with tax reform is trying to go through the code and eliminate a lot of the credits and deductions that have been built over the code for the last 3 or 4 decades. And there are a lot of folks who get this credit, but the problem is you can't have lower rates if we keep special deals in the code for picking some winners over some losers. And I would say that one of the careful considerations that we took in this legislation is that the bill provides for transition relief over taxpayers currently claiming the credit to complete their full 2-year time frame for receiving the benefit. Taxpayers who have not yet begun claiming the credit have 180 days from the date of enactment to begin the 2-year period of benefit. So I think we have sufficiently taken care of this issue, and I hope that the bill will remain consistent to get rid of many of these credits, even though this may be a good credit, like a lot of credits, but we have to get rid of them.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Neal, you're recognized to speak on.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this is a superb credit. This has been a transformative investment tool for cities across the Northeast, and I've got to tell you, I just came back from Charleston, South Carolina in the spring. And I want to tell you, if there's a better example of how the historic tax credit has been used in America, I'm not aware of it. Brownstones have been brought back to life, neighborhoods have been transformed, investment has occurred, property taxes have gone up, and people that at one time began the outmigration from urban America, then found new sustenance and opportunity by coming back to these old cities. And again, the millennial class continues to change how these cities are lived in. They invest by sending their children to the public schools. Once they come back, they support the arts. Once they come back, they support neighborhood associations. And I can't imagine anyone from the South opposing the historic tax credit. What it has done in areas surrounding old Civil War battlefields, which is a very important part, again, of our considerations. But one of the things that the gentleman from California said, well, there's some good credits. This is a great credit. This gets people to do what we want them to in terms of incentive, but for the credit, the investment wouldn't occur. So I think that we attempt on that basis to, again, lure investment back to historic buildings that, by the way, again, in terms of the architecture, in terms of those great Italian artisans that came to New England, that reshaped the destiny of those old buildings, the town halls, those beautiful old congregational churches that adorned green spaces and town squares across all of New England, where the founders had enough sense to say, okay, we're going to build the church, and then we build the municipal building, and then we build, of course, the public library, which is the envy of architecture everywhere across New England. This is a good amendment. It should be maintained, and I want to include in the record a letter from the largest taxpayer in Southbridge, Massachusetts, Franklin Realty, the following. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back.
I would yield my 49 seconds to Ms. Del Bene, to Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Ranking Member Neal. I just wanted to respond to the gentleman from California. You know, I do understand that in order to provide this huge tax cut to the wealthy, we have to figure out what to cut. I just don't understand why you would cut such an incentive as historic tax credit, which would only give you $50 billion, but yet it would decrease the amount of revitalization in economic cities across this nation by $131.5 billion. So 5 times more help would go to job creations than it would actually hurt. And so I know that in this debate about tax reform, we're making value choices. I'm just saying, choose cities and municipalities and towns across America over the wealthy. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. This is
I'd like to
parliamentary
submit
inquiry.
for the record, a unanimous request to submit for the record from the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development Division of State Historic Preservation, a letter that underscores what Mr. Neal and Mrs. Sewell have said.
Without objection. Mr. T. You're recognized to speak on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Barthold, but Mr. Neal woke me up when he talked about Italian architecture in New England. Thank you. I want to associate myself with the gentleman's remarks.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
This is another opportunity not to say how great we are, but to vote with us.
Okay.
How did you know I was going to tell you how great you were? Mr. Barthold, with respect to the historic tax credit, I had a constituent involved in a project in West Virginia using the low-income housing tax credit as well as private activity bonds and the historic tax credit to rebuild and renovate a large project for housing in West Virginia. And he was told by the banker, I'm not sure this is correct, so if you could maybe clarify this, that the project, which is supposed to close in January, will now be at risk because the effective date of the bill is before the project is supposed to close. Does that make sense to you?
I think not, Mr. T. Under the transition rule that actually Mr. Nunes described, the transition rule, 180-day period for projects that are underway.
So they should be fine if they're closing on January 31st.
Sounds like it, without knowing
You're the
specifics,
expert.
but be happy to. I'm sure the chairman's staff, our staff, be happy to take materials from your constituent and see what their situation is, and then report back to you.
Great. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to urge the rejection of this amendment at the time being, and the ranking member knows that I'm supportive of the historic tax credit, have seen the beauty of it in urban parts of my district, but rural parts of my district as well, where private investment hasn't quite frankly, for sometimes decades, gone into some of these areas, and the historic tax credit has been used to do that. So, Mr. Chairman, as you and I have had conversations and will continue to try to figure out a way that we can, in the end, preserve some of these tax credits that have had life-changing aspects in some of our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Tiberri.
Urge the
Continuing
rejection.
to raise this issue in such a positive way. Thank you. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I just wanted to speak in support of this amendment. The historic tax credit has been a powerful economic force, playing itself out and through every city in America, including mine of Buffalo, New York. Over the last 5 years, $500 million in projects have restored 70 historic buildings in Western New York. The other thing is, you know, the historic tax credit is essential driver of private investment to restore physically and financially challenging historic buildings throughout America. The historic tax credit returns more in revenue to the federal government than the tax credits actually cost. In fact, the federal government receives $1.25 in tax revenues for each dollar invested. $23 million in federal tax credits nationally generated $28 billion in federal tax revenues for historic rehabilitation projects. So I would ask the committee to please consider the value of the projects to local communities throughout America, but also the positive impact it has on the federal budget. It's a net contributor to the federal budget. And I yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Sewell.
Thank you for the gentleman from New York for yielding, and also for the eloquence about how historic tax credits have helped Buffalo, New York. You know, I misrepresented. It turns out that the cost of repealing the historic tax credit would actually only raise $50 million, not billion dollars. So I want to stand corrected. But I can tell you that it will generate $131.8 billion in economic revitalization. So the math doesn't add up. The math just doesn't add up. And I know that all across America, all of us have districts that would benefit from this historic tax credit. And as Ranking Member Neal said, no area benefits more than the Deep South. And I can tell you that in my historic city of Selma, Alabama, there are so many beautiful antebellum homes that have been revitalized in downtown areas all across my district. And, you know, I am baffled by the fact that we are making these kinds of value judgments that don't yield that much revenue, but yet are taking away, decreasing the amount of economic revitalization by billions of dollars. It actually makes no sense. And so this is actually a no-brainer, in my opinion. It is something that should go back into the code, and I would hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who I know have benefited, their districts have benefited from historic tax credits, will see the value in making sure that we side with local governments and local municipalities.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. You're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Ms. Sewell for bringing this amendment before us today. I really don't understand it. It is difficult for me to understand. For those of you who have traveled through the South, other parts of America, who've grown up in the South, I grew up in rural Alabama, lived in Tennessee, now live in Georgia. And historic tax credit has changed many of our towns, our cities. Historic tax credit was helping to save the old Rosenwald schools, churches, historic buildings, remaking our towns and our neighborhoods. It's only a small amount of money can help change America, to save our history and preserve it for generations yet unborn. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Dogg, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a historic moment. I applaud the amendment. It is, in the overall context of this bill, a very modest amendment. And if even this modest amendment is opposed, which it is, it gives us some indication of the way this week has gone. So here we are on the 4th day of hearings. Every single Democratic amendment has been rejected, in many cases with absolutely amazing circus-level contortions by some of our Republican friends explaining why they are voting against something that their constituents support in order to get it eventually somewhere in this process. And so, given where we are, 11:40, with votes about to happen, with our not having been provided the manager's amendment, I think we need to consider this historic point. Understand that at this point on the 4th day of the hearing, the only thing which has changed the cost of this bill is an amendment the chairman offered. That's the only amendment that's been adopted. And it added a big gift to multinational corporations, and so now it exceeds the budget limit. And that's the purported excuse for needing to have another manager's amendment, is to correct what we were not told the first manager's amendment does. And so in that circumstance, I would yield, Mr. Chairman, to ask you, since you're rejecting every single idea we advance, I've got some other amendments. Other people have amendments. I've not conferred with them about how they feel about it. But if we withdrew every other amendment that we've got, and knowing you're going to reject them anyway, are you ready to present the manager's amendment and tell us what secrets you're hiding there?
Mr. Doggett, we'll continue to abide by regular order, and I know last night there was a great to-do about not having time to offer your amendments. We certainly are going to continue to offer that full and open debate. It will be your decision whether to offer that.
If we withdrew every amendment that I've got, that anyone else has got, would we just be put in recess, or would we have an opportunity to see your secret proposal that y'all have worked out here in the back rooms, I suppose, amongst yourselves and with the Washington special interest that won out with amendment number 1 with the big giveaway to corporate America on multinational tax offshoring and hiding their money?
And no, we will continue with regular order.
Well, does regular order include calling a recess or considering your amendment?
We will continue with full and open debate on all amendments Democrats or Republicans offer, as our committee rules require.
I appreciate that, and I assume what that means is that you're still not ready to present the manager's amendment to correct the fiscal irresponsibility of the first giveaway to corporate America, and that we would just go into recess. So I suppose it's reasonable for us to continue offering an amendment to a bill that may not be the bill we eventually consider.
Ms. Jenkins, you're recognized to speak on the amendment. Ms. Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to Chairman Teaberry.
Thank you, Ms. Jenkins. The gentleman from Texas makes a fascinating point, and it would be even more fascinating for those of you in the audience who weren't here in 2009 to remember the Obamacare debate and the Affordable Care Act debate, which the gentleman from Texas sat through and watched as every single amendment that we offered was dismissed. And this chairman has been more fair than that chairman. We did not see an amendment until 12-something a.m. in the morning to a 2,000-page bill. Every single one of our amendments was rejected, 50 of them. In fact, the chairman didn't even know I was a member of the committee. It was so pathetic. And I'm not kidding. He did not know that I was a member of the committee. And then when he figured it out, he didn't even pronounce me the right name. And so I know, isn't that amazing? And that's true. It's absolutely true. So much for inclusiveness when you don't even know who the minority members are. So I love Mr. Doggett's replay of this, but Chairman Brady has been more than fair as you compare it to when the minority was in the majority. And as one who loves many members of the minority, again, history's an amazing thing to look at. You know, my wish would be that me and Bill Pascrell, or me and Richie Neal, or me and John Larson, certainly not future Speaker Crowley. But the rest of us could probably sit
Jim,
in
will
the
you
room.
yield for a question, Jim?
Sure. Yeah, I would have you. Yeah. But
Where are the women?
I
Is my query. What about the women?
Mr. Pomeroy has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will take advantage of that.
But seriously, I mean, come on. Let's not be holier than thou. Nobody up here on these two dioceses can sit here and be holier than thou. At the end of the day, the chairman, whether it's Chairman Rangel, whether it's Chairman Levin, whether it's Chairman Brady, have a very difficult job. And none of us, quite frankly, understand how difficult it is. And the chairman is trying his darn best, and I think he's done a better job than past chairmans of trying to high-wire a very difficult act. And I appreciate it.
I'd like
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. T.
this amendment.
If I may, in order, we have Mr. Crowley and Dr. Davis as well. Mr. Crowley, you're recognized.
I would just want to state for the record that the former chairman of the committee used to refer to me as Mr. Crawley. So it wasn't just the minority, Charles, okay? So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to enter, if I can, into a colloquy with my friend from the great state of Alabama. Ms. Sewell, I know that there's an effort, certainly in the South, to preserve both antebellum and postbellum architecture and structures. I read with great interest recently, and I don't recall what periodical it was in, the attempt to preserve slave quarters, which primarily is on private property throughout the South, that they're crumbling and withering. Would this tax credit help to preserve those structures as well?
Thanks for the question, the gentleman from New York. As long as the buildings are certified by the Department of Interior, and usually that's because they are on some sort of historic registry, if these slave quarters, which I think some of them are, do qualify, yes, they would be able to take advantage of the historic tax credit. Once again, it has to be a certified building, and the certification is done through state preservation organizations as well as through the National Park Service.
Yeah. And I know that there are many who are concerned that the state of life as it existed for those who were held in bondage prior and during the Civil War, that if these buildings were to be lost, that much of that story would be lost as well. Is that not true?
That is true.
I appreciate the gentlelady's amendment, and I think it's important for our colleagues to understand just what the impact will have on future generations if this tax credit is not maintained. And we'll yield the balance of my time to the gentlelady from Alabama.
Thanks. Not only will it affect, our history of slavery, but it will affect every aspect of our history. These are historic buildings that tell the story of America, frankly. And that is what the National Park Service is there for, to make sure that next generations understand the history that is, the fulsome history that is America. So everything from slave quarters to, civil rights sites, such as the A.G. Gadsden Motel in Birmingham, Alabama, where, the gathering of civil rights leaders, including our very own John Lewis, took place in the 60s that really led to the voting rights and civil rights movement, but as well as, Confederate sites. I grew up in Selma, where we have a very complicated history of not only civil rights, but also Civil War. That history lives side by side in many parts of the South, and so all of our communities can benefit from historic tax credits, because it's really about the preservation of the American experience, and every district has a story to tell that is uniquely American, that has buildings that would qualify. Thanks.
Dr. Davis, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as we've already heard, this country is replete with structures, buildings that are not just buildings, but they really speak to the history and development of this country. I heard John Lewis mention
Rosenwald, a man who lived in my community, but who developed more than 500 schools in the rural South for African American communities who at that time did not have a school. My district has more Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in it than any other place in the world. It also has the tremendous Bronzeville area, where scores of African American entertainers and actors, Joe Louis and others, lived during the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Plus, we have structures downtown Chicago that were there when the Chicago fire took place. They survived. So it's not just a matter of reconstructing. These buildings have reached obsolescence. And unless there's an infusion of capital, local developers, local governments cannot do it alone. Philanthropists cannot do it alone. So we need the faith and credit of our country to stand behind. So I'm pleased to join with Representative Sewell and the others who've spoken in favor of the retention of these credits, because they indeed would be a credit to America. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We will recess committee for votes, return, vote on the pending amendments, and continue and finish discussion on this amendment. The committee is recessed until following floor votes.